This is not a surprise to anybody. It's really sad that it's got to this point, but I've got to do something for my own mental health, for my wife's.
This is not a surprise to anyone close to the family. It had been building for years, quietly, beneath the surface of every polished photograph and every carefully worded statement. But now, for the first time, the silence had broken. The Kingdom of Alden Moor had never seen a crisis like this. In one unexpected release, a sealed family record tied to two young royals, Prince Elias and Princess Wren, was placed before the public, and the shockwave reached Raven's Hollow, the coastal estate where their parents, Prince Dorian and Princess Isolde, had lived since stepping back from royal duties 3 years earlier. Dorian read the statement once, then again, and the silence around him grew heavier than any accusation ever could. Isolde stood close enough to see the words reflected in his face before she fully absorbed them herself. The Alden Moor Royal Council had released an official record concerning the lineage documentation of Elias and Wren, a phrase that alone carried the weight of a door being forced open after years of being sealed shut. The record was not new information exactly, but its release was. It confirmed the existence of an internal review that had been conducted years earlier, one the family had quietly agreed to keep private. The statement did not reveal everything. It confirmed that a formal review had taken place, while withholding the full details of who had requested it, when, and why it had resurfaced now. That missing context made everything worse. Dorian understood immediately what it meant. If the council was willing to release even part of this record, then the family's old agreements, the quiet compromises that had kept the peace for years, no longer held the same power they once did. Isolde understood something else just as sharply. Once the council controlled the first sentence of this story, anything the family said afterward would sound like defense, not truth. That was the trap. Not the record itself, but the timing, the phrasing, the calculated confidence of an institution that had chosen its moment with precision. King Aldric, Dorian's father, had not spoken publicly yet, but his influence was felt in every line of the statement. Crown Prince Cassian, Dorian's older brother, had not appeared before any cameras, but his authority was clearly behind the decision. Princess Moriel, Cassian's wife, had said nothing yet either, though everyone close to the family suspected she would be the one to eventually speak with the most care. A senior advisor, speaking only on condition of anonymity to a trusted family friend, warned that the full file contained more than the review's conclusions. It included private notes, internal disagreements, and decisions that were never meant to leave the council's archive. That was why this first release felt like only the beginning. Something else was still buried inside that file, something that would eventually reach far beyond Dorian and Isolde. But before understanding what the record truly meant, it helps to understand the people standing at the center of this unfolding story. Behind the palace walls of Alden Moor, this had never been only about paperwork or procedure. It was about two children who had become, without ever asking for it, symbols in a much larger family struggle. Elias and Wren were still too young to understand any of this. Dorian and Isolde had spent years trying to give them something resembling an ordinary life, away from cameras and formal titles, in a house by the sea where the children could simply be children. Now that effort felt suddenly fragile. Dorian felt anger first, sharp and immediate. But fear followed close behind. He was not thinking like a prince trying to fight the council. He was thinking like a father, wondering what Elias and Wren would eventually be told, and by whom, about a story that had started long before they were born. Isolde watched that fear settle into him, and her own shock hardened into something colder and more focused. The council had not simply revisited old paperwork. It had reached into the most private part of their family and placed it back into official conversation. And once something re-enters official records, it rarely fades quietly again. For years, the tension between Dorian and the rest of the royal family had been about something simpler. His decision to step back, to raise his children outside the traditional structure, to build a life the old guard within the palace considered a quiet rebellion. Now the conversation had shifted onto entirely different ground. It was no longer about lifestyle or choices. It was about documentation, about records, about the kind of permanence that outlives any one person's feelings. Meanwhile, King Aldric sat alone with the file open in front of him. He did not pretend the decision ahead of him was painless. He removed his glasses slowly and placed them on the table, as though the simple motion gave him one more second before duty took over from the father inside him. The authority of the crown was not, in his mind, cruelty. It was structure. It was the mechanism that kept centuries of tradition from collapsing into confusion. But he also understood that structure has a cost, and this time the cost would fall on his own grandchildren. Cassian received word of his father's decision with a kind of controlled stillness. He had been told, through a formal briefing, that the record could affect how Elias and Wren were referenced in future royal materials going forward. That did not mean cruelty either. It meant precision. Every title, every family listing, every ceremonial mention would now be reviewed more carefully than before. Cassian understood why that mattered, even if he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. The next generation would inherit whatever confusion the current generation failed to resolve cleanly. If that meant some difficult decisions now, he reasoned, it might spare Elias and Wren a messier reckoning later. Moriel's presence in this story grew quietly but steadily. She understood, in a way few others in the family did, how young lives could be shaped by public scrutiny long before they had any power to respond to it. She had watched from a distance as Dorian and Isolde built their life away from the estate, and she had never judged them for it. But she also knew that distance does not make a family immune to institutional decisions made without its input. The record itself had not appeared out of nowhere. Its release had roots in a single, quiet meeting weeks earlier, one that no one outside a small circle had known about. At a private family gathering at Aldenmoor's old countryside chapel, a routine question about how Elias and Wren should be formally listed in an upcoming ceremonial document had turned an otherwise ordinary afternoon into something colder. Dorian had joined that meeting by video call, expecting a brief, procedural update. Isolde had been told the same thing. That was why the hesitation in the room, audible even through a phone screen, felt like a quiet betrayal once it reached her fully. A senior official had paused mid-sentence during that meeting and pointed toward a note in an old family registry. The date on that note did not match an earlier private assurance that had been given to King Aldrich years before. That single mismatch changed the tone of the entire conversation. Isolde later learned that officials had requested formal verification instead of simply accepting the family's earlier informal agreement, and her shock hardened quickly into frustration. It felt, to her, as though the palace had stopped treating her children as children and started treating them as a technical problem to be solved. Dorian tried to push back during that call, asking why an old date mattered so much when the family already understood their children's place within it. The answer, delivered carefully, almost apologetically, stayed with him for weeks afterward. Records eventually become history, and history eventually becomes the basis for authority. King Aldrich would one day be gone, and whoever came after him would need to defend decisions made long before their time. A king cannot defend a record that even his own officials once quietly questioned. That single meeting became the point of no return. It gave King Aldrich a reason to finally address the matter directly, and it gave Cassian time to prepare for a conversation with his brother that neither of them wanted to have. That conversation came without cameras, without staff nearby, without any of the ceremonial softness that usually surrounded difficult royal discussions. Dorian arrived believing he could still challenge the process, still argue for restraint, still convince his family to step back from a decision that felt inevitable. Across from him sat Cassian, calm and steady, carrying something Dorian could not simply argue away: the quiet, procedural authority of an institution that had already moved past informal family agreement. Dorian did not sit easily through that meeting. He carried the frustration of a father who believed his children had been pulled into a situation they never chose and could not understand. Cassian watched him, not with any sense of victory, but with the tired sadness of someone who already suspected this conversation would not fully heal anything between them. Cassian explained, as gently as the subject allowed, that ignoring a formally reviewed record left the family exposed to bigger questions later. Releasing too much, too soon, risked turning two children into public talking points before they were old enough to understand any of it. The right path, he believed, sat somewhere narrow and difficult between those two extremes. Dorian pushed his chair back, the sound cutting through the quiet room like a small warning. Cassian remained seated. "This cannot be undone the way it was before," he said simply. Dorian heard the words, but what stayed with him longest was what came directly after. Cassian confirming that their father would ultimately decide the final shape of any public acknowledgement. The brothers had entered that room as brothers. They left it, for the first time in years, as two people standing on opposite sides of the same difficult decision, still bound by family but no longer aligned in how to protect it. In the weeks that followed, Moriel reached out privately to Isolde, away from advisors, away from prepared statements, away from anyone who might turn their conversation into another carefully managed message. Two women who had stood on different sides of an old family divide spoke honestly, without pretense, about what actually mattered in that moment, the well-being of two children who had not asked to be part of any of it. Moriel reminded Isolde gently that whatever the institution decided, the children themselves did not have to carry the full weight of adult disagreements. That reassurance did not erase the pain of the previous weeks, but it gave the family, fractured as it was, something to hold on to. A shared understanding that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how complicated the adult's history became. In the end, the loudest part of this story was not the record itself, or the meetings, or even the disagreements between brothers. It was the quiet understanding that eventually settled over the family. That institutions can demand precision and permanence, but they cannot demand that people stop caring about each other. Dorian and Isolde returned to their quiet life by the sea, wiser and warier. Elias and Ren, for now, remained simply children, protected as much as any family, royal or otherwise, can manage to protect the people it loves most.